How we doing out there? Minister Joshua Woods here, back with the sixth installment, I believe, of my sermon series, Issues in the Church. We're now transitioning from Galatia to Philippians, the book of Philippians, discussing the church at Philippi. But before I get into that, I want to clear up a few things that I said in my last video. So in my last video, or my last collection of videos, my last installment, I talked about not being really aware of the book, where I learned about Peter visiting James, or actually James visiting Peter, and him leaving once he noticed that he's coming. So that was in Galatia. That was actually in our book that we were studying. That was in Galatians. So let me just read real quick. I'm going to read from the English Standard Version of Galatians, 2nd chapter. And Paul is basically talking about circumcision again, because the church at Galatia had been dealing with circumcision because false teachers had crept in, and they basically started this false teaching about circumcision, and you're not really a Jew unless you circumcise yourself, and it's mandatory, and you're an illegitimate Jew, and you're not loved by Christ, and all this stuff, presumably basically making their whole faith illegitimate until they get circumcised. So Paul is now addressing what he understood about people like Peter, who would say the same thing: you need to be circumcised, but you lived as a Gentile. So let's get, I may have went into a little bit, let me go into it again. 2nd chapter, and going to the 7th verse. On the contrary, when they saw that I had been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been entrusted with the gospel to the circumcised. For he who worked through Peter for his apostolic ministry to the circumcised worked also through me, talking about Jesus Christ, for mine to the Gentiles. And when James and Cephas and John, who seemed to be pillars, who seemed to be iconic with gospel preaching, perceived the grace that was given to me, they gave the right hand of fellowship to Barnabas and me, that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. Only they asked us to remember the poor, which is the very thing I was eager to do. 11th verse, but when Cephas, Peter, came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face. This is the famous standoff that Peter mentions to another disciple, apostle, Peter. Paul mentions he withstood Peter to his face because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, he was eating with the Gentiles, but when they came, he drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party. Now, the reason why I believe, and I just did some research, that Peter left, and it was mostly because he wanted everyone to think that he was a Jew and he didn't hang out with Gentiles, and he was absolutely embarrassed, because I said in my last video he was embarrassed. The reason why I believe that is because right after Paul said that he separated himself, he said he was fearing the circumcision party, which I had, labeled also the circumcision police. So he feared the circumcision party. Plus, James was pretty zealous over Jews and those that wanted to be Jews being circumcised and adhering to the customs and beliefs of the Jewish law. So in Acts 21, it talks about how James was excited to see Paul, and then James tells Paul that he's heard about his achievements, and he heard about some of the success from him preaching the gospel. But it's only fair that I let you know that we have some brothers here that are excited about following your teaching, but they've been saying that as exciting as your teaching and preaching is, you're also telling individuals that they should forsake Moses and that circumcision is not necessary. So if you go back and read Acts 21, it talks about this. And James tells Paul that he basically wants him to take these four brothers who have made a vow. They have made a vow that they're going to go off the teachings of Paul, and they're going to instruct everyone else to adhere to the teachings of Paul and make it clear that he's not forsaking Moses. So he's telling him about his success. Paul comes to James and some of the other disciples, and he's telling them about his success, that he's been having. And this is in Jerusalem where they meet. And the elders of James was with them. And after greeting each other and explaining their works in the ministry, James actually said, how many thousands that are here, in Jerusalem, that are among the Jews who have believed. They are all zealous, along with himself. He's zealous too, for the law. And they have been told about you that you teach all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or walk according to our customs. What then is to be done? They will certainly hear that you have come. Do therefore what we tell you. We have 4 men who are under a vow. Take these men and purify yourself along with them and pay their expenses. Circumcise yourself, circumcise them, and tell them that you are not here to forsake Moses, and you're actually going to adhere to the Hebrew customs and everything that they should believe. Now, that coincides with Christ as well. So it was within reason that Peter left. But here's what Paul had to say about that. Peter is a hypocrite at this point, how Paul is laying it out. He says, certain men from James in the book of Galatians, 2nd chapter, had came to visit Peter. And when he learned about this, as they were arriving, he left because he was hanging out with the Gentiles. And he has been preaching Jews should not hang out with the Gentiles, not till they get circumcised. The Gentiles has to get circumcised. When James and some of these people who have been having meetings with Peter and saying that this has to be preached. You can't be hanging around Jews if you're not circumcised. You can't be hanging around Gentiles, cannot be associating with Jews if you're not trying to adhere to the customs. He's drinking with them and eating with them. Paul describes how Peter is eating with these people. He's drinking with these people. And he didn't even have to leave, because not only was he acting as a hypocrite, but even Barnabas, a person who was partnered with Paul in the ministry, he acted hypocritically as well. Peter had nothing to be afraid of, because the Jews that were with James that came to visit Peter, they acted hypocritical as well. They ate and drank with the Gentiles. So what does Paul say later when he meets up with Peter? He meets up with them and he says in the 14th verse, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you force the Gentiles to live like Jews? Because after all, nobody is forcing you to live like a Jew. Nobody is forcing you to do the things that you know that is coinciding with Judaism. But How can you force Gentiles to live like Jews if you yourself don't even live like a Jew? Just hypocrisy. So that's what we're going to go into. We're going to go into hypocrisy. And furthermore, you had nothing to worry about. You had nothing to be afraid of, because when the men got there, they ate and drank with the Gentiles as well. So you actually thinking that you need to leave because you don't want to be embarrassed? You've been hanging out here drinking, you've been hanging out here eating, and they didn't really like that. Guess what? When they got there, they was doing the same thing. You had nothing to worry about. You didn't even have to leave. So that's basically what Paul is talking about. Just wanted to clear that up. In Galatians, that was second chapter of Galatians, I believe, beginning with the 11th verse, talking about Peter. Now, I don't have much to worry about with time on this installment because there's only 4 chapters to Philippians. So first and foremost, as I've always said, every letter that Paul writes is inspired by a problem. The contrast that I'm going to make with the church of Philippi versus all the other churches that I've talked about, Corinth and Rome and Galatia, they actually didn't have many problems. They had conflicts, as Paul categorized it, but they didn't have many problems. So in this 4-chapter book, Paul is basically exhorting them. He's encouraging them. He's uplifting them, but he is noticing a few issues, and he points them out, and even individuals who have issues, and he calls them out by name. Paul, he calls things out by name. He doesn't hold back. He calls issues out by name, and he calls people out by name. If we had a preacher that existed right now that did this, you probably wouldn't even have many people in that church, because they'll be gone. They will consider this offensive. But hey, we're addressing issues and we're calling it like it is. And we're not gonna make everybody guilty of something when we know it's only 2 people doing this. And how many jobs have you worked at where you had to go to a meeting and there was an incident and somebody did something, stole something, said something they weren't supposed to say, and everybody got to hear about it, and you had nothing to do with it. So there's that type of teaching of a lesson, and then there's calling it out by name, going to the individual themselves, or going to the whole group and calling individuals out by name and calling the issues out by name. And that was the method that Paul chose. So without further ado, let me first state my problem as clearly as this. I'm gonna go in the order this time as they appear. So number 1, there was a conflict, or there was a conflict within members of the church within themselves, getting content with past achievements and felt like they didn't have to work as hard for achievements. They were being too content, probably leaders of the church, certain administrators, people who were the chairman of the board or whatever. They were getting content with past achievements, and they felt like they didn't have to work as hard no more. The success is going to be there regardless. Why work as hard? Paul says, no, that's the issue. So that's the first thing that we're going to address. And that's in the 3rd chapter. After that, we're going to address a conflict where people feel they can have their own example. Look at the people around us. Paul says, no, follow after my example. I don't want you looking after each other and looking at this person as an example. No, follow my example. And then the third is going to be conflicts within the congregation. Conflicts within the congregation in general. So without further ado, Philippians 1st chapter, beginning with the 1st verse. Timothy is the deliverer of the letter, and he greets them as this: Paul and Timothy, bondservants of Jesus Christ, to all the saints in Christ Jesus who are in Philippi. With the bishops and deacons, grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. I thank my God upon every remembrance of you, always in every prayer of mine making requests for you all with joy, for your fellowship in the gospel from the first day until now, being confident of this very thing, that he who has begun a good work in you will complete it until the day of Jesus Christ. Just as it is right for me to think this of you all, because I have you in my heart, insomuch as both in my chains and in the defense and confirmation of the gospel, you all are partakers with me of grace. I'm gonna stop right there, and we're gonna pick up in the second video. Thank you.